Okay, we're back. We're going to walk through this chart again. Hopefully you can see it all right. We'll do a little bit of this. So what I want to show you is what these things actually sound like. So we have these two different phonemes, P and B, as they're normally written out. In onset position, I've got two samples here. So we've got beak,
beak,
and we've got peak.
peak,
Okay, so this is our aspiration in peak.
peak,
It's really easy to spot. We've got a brief release burst here. Oops. You can kind of hear that. You can kind of make an ejective to hear just the release burst by itself, but here's the aspiration. I don't have a whole lot of aspiration. You hopefully can see that. That's about 38.7 milliseconds.
peak,
And then we go straight to the vowel. And there's a lot of release bursts here for the K at the end. And maybe a little bit of aspiration too.
peak,
These things are really easy to spot on a spectrogram, which makes it easy as well to spot the release burst here for the B.
beak,
And then we go straight to the vowel, right? What we don't see is any voicing in either one of these. So this is a combination. We have a voiceless aspirated stop for P,
peak,
and we have a voiceless unaspirated stop for B
beak,
in initial position. Now I'm going to play you the speak. This is after an S.
speak, speak,
Okay, so we write this one with a P, but if you get rid of the S, what do you hear?
beak, beak,
How'd that happen?
speak, beak,
All of a sudden, it sounds like it's a B again. And what's going on is
beak, beak,
it's the exact same sort of stop we get here in an initial B.
beak,
It's voiceless, unaspirated. So after an S, you don't get a contrast between the two types. And I can kind of play around with this a little bit. Let's see. We'll go to version of peak, and we will just copy and paste. So if you want to know how to do this, go to Edit, Copy, Selection of Soundboard, and I'm going to put this right after the S. There's a little bit of noise there. And say, what does this sound like? Oops, I don't want to do that. I want to put it here. Okay, just going to paste. We'll cut it off there. So this is what it would sound like if you had aspiration in this context.
speak, speak,
And I think you can hear that.
speak,
I don't think many people speak that way, but maybe you do.
speak,
Either way, I think you can hear it. That's not what native English speakers normally do in that context. They do this.
speak, beak,
And make an unaspirated stop there. I can also show you rabid and rapid.
rabid,
Not the ideal recordings, but they're not too bad. So rapid.
rapid,
Wait, the stop in the middle is voiceless. There's a little bit of echo there coming through, but here we get a fair amount of voicing. You hear that low frequency voicing again,
rabid, rabid,
which is characteristic of a truly voiced stop. That sort of canonical distinction is something you normally only see in medial position. Last but not least, there's a fairly complicated relationship we get for the appearance of these phonemes in syllable final position. I'm not going to write it on the board because it's not super easy to sort of abbreviate. But for a phonemically voiceless stop like P, the vowels preceding that stop will be short. However, that closure for P will tend to be a little bit longer than you get for a B stop closure. And on the other hand, the vowels preceding the phonemically voiced stop B will tend to be longer. So the vowels are providing cues here. There's also duration cues in the vowels for what's going on in the consonants. Whereas in the initial position, we're getting kind of duration cues in the amount of aspiration. Here we're getting it in the length of the vowel, which is interesting. We also get it a little bit in the length of the stop itself. You can kind of think about this. Voice stops are kind of hard to make, or at least they're hard to sustain. So you tend to make voiced stops a little bit shorter than voiceless stops because you can hold a voiceless stop forever if you really want to, or at least as long as you want. So the moral of the story is that the phonological voiced versus voiceless contrast in English is something pretty abstract, as we often see in language. It doesn't boil down to just one thing at the phonemic or phonetic level, as we've seen in this chart. And there's another column that I didn't even write down there, which is more abstract than either of those three relationships. So those phonemic contrasts have different phonetic manifestations and different context in English. And back in the day, Lisker and Abramson actually suggested describing that contrast as one of fortis versus lenis rather than voiced versus voiceless. So I believe the fortis stop would be the P and the lenis stop would be the B. Yeah, so if you want to, you can describe it like that. Otherwise, you can just think of it in terms of like these phonemes here. But don't get confused between those and what we actually see at the phonetic level. Okay, I've got some examples of different types of aspiration throughout the world's languages here to kind of wrap this up. So one thing I'll point out is there's no a priori reason why stops can't be pre-aspirated rather than post-aspirated. So this is where you'd have aspiration before the release burst of the, before you make the stop. Not before the release burst, but before the stop in general. So Icelandic has aspirated stops and pre-aspirated stops. This is what they sound like.
Kapp,
So you just kind of devoice the vowel there before you get to the stop.
vitt, dökk,
So on and so forth. And that doesn't sound the same as,
gapp, vitt, dökk,
right? Icelandic is kind of a fun language because there are a lot of languages that devoice obstruents in final position because, again, obstruents are kind of hard to voice by nature. So languages like German devoice obstruents in final position, Russian, so on and so forth. Icelandic will devoice sonorants too, even though sonorants are easier to voice. We get this sort of pattern in Farsi as well, or Persian, where they're going to devoice this alveolar trill.
koppar, mættir, þekkja,
Oh, sorry, there isn't one there.
koppar, mættir,
And maybe you can hear that. But these are nice because they have the pre-aspirated stops too.
koppar, mættir,
Yeah, so Icelandic is pretty cool. I'll give you another example. I believe this is from Cantonese.
sa,
Sorry, I should have put it down here. But these, I think this is Cantonese, not Mandarin. Sorry about that.
sa,
Anyways, what's interesting about this language is that it has aspirated affricates, which is pretty cool. So basically, you go from a sibilant fricative to just like a glottal fricative and aspirating an affricate. So listen closely, you might be able to hear it.
sa, za, ta,
Ta. So yeah, it's basically a combination of sequence of like S to H there.
sha, ja, cha,
Or
xia,
the alveolar palatals.
ja, cha,
This one's kind of hard to hear.
cha,
These aren't too bad.
cha, ta,
And in this case, if you're going to calculate VOT, you're going to have to do it slightly differently. You're going to have to calculate it from the offset of sibilants. So rather than there being a nice release burst landmark for you to work with, you have to say, look for where the sibilance ends. And you can kind of see it here in these retroflex affricates.
ja,
So here's our sibilant right there. And then you can kind of see where it stops and goes to just being more like an H.
cha,
Cha. And I don't have a measure here, but that would be your aspiration in this particular case. Normally, you'd measure it from the release burst, which is here. Yeah, I eliminated these a second ago. I shouldn't have, but this kind of reminds me of the tree pronunciation in English. And I'll mention as well, I've observed this sort of pattern with aspirated affricates in Quebecois French as well. I don't have some good examples. Maybe I should get some, because there's a few Quebecois French speakers around. But in the meantime, we'll just listen to two different pronunciations of the word tree.
Tree, tree.
This is
tree.
me trying to produce the T in this context with just aspiration. Maybe you buy that that's not a sibilant. Maybe you think that instead it's produced with sibilants in this context.
Tree.
Like ch or ch, like a retroflex affricate. And that might sound different from that.
Tree. Tree.
The problem is this here is produced in a post-alveolar place of articulation, and you tend to round your lips for an as well. So if you're making that, you're making something very similar to that sh sound, like sh. We normally round our lips for it in English, so it's going to sound a lot like a post-alveolar sibilant anyways, or a retroflex sibilant.
Tree, tree,
even if it's pronounced like that.
tree,
So why not just make it easy and produce it as an affricate, which is what happens a lot in English. Okay. Also talking about affricates, I'll show you a little bit of what I know about the voicing distinction in affricates. So the phonetic difference between voiced and voiceless affricates is mostly found in the duration of the affricates. And basically what you find is that the voiceless affricates, at least the fricative part of it, is a little bit longer than what you get for the voiced affricates.
cheap, jeep, cheap, jeep,
And there's not much voicing, actually, during the closure phase of the j in jeep.
jeep,
Like we normally don't voice the closure phase of a stop at the beginning of a word in English either, like in beak. We don't normally voice during the closure phase of a stop in for an affricate.
jeep,
What happens is instead there's just a difference in affrication length. So it's neatly about twice as long here for the voiceless affricate as it is for the voiced affricate.
cheap, jeep,
So isn't that kind of cool? This is me trying to switch the durations of the two different productions here,
jeep, cheap,
and
cheap,
I think that kind of does it.
jeep,
The initial one sounds like a j now,
cheap,
and the second one sounds like a ch. Yeah, so it's not a strict voice versus voiceless distinction there either. Other languages, like I said, divvy up this spectrum in different ways. So VOT works really well for a language like Thai or any language which has kind of a two-way distinction between voiced and voiceless. There are other languages, though, like Hindi, which has a four-way phonation contrast distinction. So this is pretty cool, but Hindi will distinguish between two types of voiced stops and two types of voiceless stops. So it's a kind of a 2x2 pattern where you have voiced aspirated and voiced unaspirated, and then you also have voiceless aspirated and voiceless unaspirated. So rather than just describing it, I'll just show it to you. So here we have a voiced unaspirated stop. Sorry, a voiced unaspirated stop.
ball,
Voiceless unaspirated stop.
ball,
Voiceless aspirated.
ball,
And then interestingly, this voiced aspirated stop.
ball,
Bah. So what's happening here is he's truly voicing the closure phase of this stop, and then there's aspiration after it where it's breathy voiced aspiration. It's not just a normal voiceless aspiration.
ball,
I'll play a couple more columns.
dal, tal, thal, dhar, dal, tal, thal, dhal,
Might as well play these affricates as well, see what they sound like with aspiration.
jal, chal, chal, jhal,
Those are pretty subtle. One thing I like about this sort of set of stops is these guys. So normally in English, we don't make much of a distinction between voiced unaspirated and voiceless aspirated. Normally as English listeners, we don't care about a strict voicing distinction at the beginning of a word. So a voiced unaspirated stop will sound a lot like a voiceless unaspirated stop to our ears. And then we don't have this place contrast either. So Hindi has dental stops and retroflex stops. They're both going to sound like an alveolar stop to native English speakers. So these four stops kind of all sound the same, but they're not.
dal, tal, dal, tal,
We'll just walk through that one more time.
dal, tal, dal, tal,
Right. So when you're a baby, you can, no matter what language environment you're growing up in, you can hear this distinction without difficulty. But if you are growing up in an English-speaking environment or a non-Hindi-speaking environment, I guess, you start to lose it by the time you're about 8 or 10 months old. So I'll show you as well what the aspiration looks like in spectrogram form
phal,
for Hindi.
phal,
So this is a voiceless, there's no voicing here, aspirated stop. We get this sort of regular turbulence we expect to see out of an H.
phal,
In the voiced aspirated stop, we get voicing all the way through the release of the stop. It begins before it's released and it continues through it. But what we don't see is nice, clear voicing for the vowel for a while. We get this sort of turbulent voicing, which is distinctive of a breathy voiced.
bhal,
It's pretty subtle, but it's there, and it's kind of easiest to pick up on at the bottom of the frequency scale where you see the continual periodic vibrations of the glottis as you walk through that part.
bhal, phal,
Right. Not every language does this. I think earlier listened to some Bengali, and I think for the last transcription exercise, we'll hear some Bengali again. So the speaker of Bengali I have recorded for that exercise has an interesting combination of a voiced stop and then a voiceless aspiration right after it. So here's the release burst for the D. There's voicing before it, there's not voicing after it, and then you get voicing when you start to get into the vowel. For the Hindi speaker, he just goes all the way through.
bhal,
dhol,
bhal,
dhol,
So if you're like me, you might hear this a bit like a voiceless T in this context.
bhal,
dhol,
Yeah. There's a at certain points in life when I'm at my nerdiest as a sports fan, I follow the sport of cricket, because why not? It's a good way to kill time. And I don't know if this guy still plays for the Indian team, but they used to have a famous player whose last name was Dhoni. Dhoni was the way you spelled his last name. That was a voiced aspirated stop to begin this one. Hopefully you can see it. I would always hear that as Tony rather than Dhoni. But you like to hear something that sounds like something you're used to in life, right? Works in perception as well as many other things. Here's some examples from Demasi, which also has a sort of contrast. So this is a series of voiced
ba,
stops at the beginning of a word, as well as voiceless unaspirated,
babu,
and then kind of voiceless aspirated stops,
pepe,
and then a voiced stop with voiceless aspiration.
pe,
So kind of stopping the voicing halfway through. I'll just walk through all these. You can sing along at home if you like.
ba, babu, pepe, pe, ta, 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 gaba, gabi, kaba, karo.
Right. So moving on, I'll point out that in certain cases you can have aspiration at the end of a syllable. These are some examples from Armenian, which has truly voiced stops in this context, truly unvoiced stops in this context, and then voiceless aspirated stops as well.
ab, gap, gap,
So it's pretty easy to kind of think about how this would work. When you release the stop, you just have a puff of air at the end if you have it aspirated. If it's not aspirated here, you don't have that puff of air. If it's truly voiced, you voice all the way through.
bag,
Bug,
bag, tak, tak,
tuck. You just add that aspiration at the tail end. So you kind of have to rethink the way we normally talk about VOT here, because voicing is not going to stop after you release the final stops here. Voicing is not going to begin again after you release the final stops here. You just have a certain amount of a puff of air, and you can measure that duration if you want to. So I'll show you what it looks like in a spectrogram again.
tak, tak,
And it's a little bit of a noisy spectrogram, but here's the release burst at this point, and there's no aspiration after it, just background noise. But for the aspirated one,
tak,
you get your release burst. Remember, Ks have this little peak here of intensity right around 1500 hertz. And then you get this aspiration, which kind of looks like an H.
tak,
That's all that's going on there to signal the difference. And I've got my little point here for my release burst and aspiration. Okay, last point I'll make in this little video is a practical point, which is that, and I've heard this for a couple of your production exercises as well, is that if you have your microphone, whether it's in your computer or like a separate mic or what have you, too close to your lips when you're recording yourself speaking, and normally this happens with P's, p, you can feel that if you hold your hand, p, pretty close to your mouth, you'll feel there'd be a puff of air that comes out, more for P's than for T's or for K's, p. And if that happens, you can get what's called clipping in the waveform. There's just kind of too much air flowing into the microphone at once. So it kind of overloads the microphone and you get this weird acoustic effect. Here's me trying to do this in the most ridiculous way possible.
I thought I saw a putty tat.
And you can hear that with the p, and putty.
I thought putty tat.
It's clipping. So there's a way to solve this. There's actually a couple of different ways I'll talk about. So the fancy way is to get what's called a pop filter, and you've probably seen this in sort of pictures of professional recording setups, wherever. It's a little thing you can attach to your microphone, and has this screen, like a mesh screen, enclosed in a plastic circle, which will sort of just buffer that airflow before it gets into the microphone and won't cause that problem for you. I've got a note here that otherwise you can make sure the microphone is not directly in front of the speaker's lips. Like if you take the microphone away from that flow of air, you're not going to feel the puff, right? That's hopefully pretty intuitive. Do that. You can do that for yourself. Like if you're wearing a head-mounted microphone, don't put that microphone right in front of your lips or what have you. I'm going to mention there's a low down and dirty way to do this in case you don't want to spend like $30 on one of these things, because how often do you use it really? Back in the day, I used to play music in a basement rock band, and we did this. Rather than buying one of these things, what you can do is take a clothes hanger, like an old wire clothes hanger, and just kind of bend it into a circle, and then take some pantyhose and just like wrap it over the clothes hanger, and it'll create a screen for you like this. And I always just kind of joked about that in class for years, but recently, because of the crazy coronavirus situation we're in, I found out that Lionel Richie, who I hope you know who Lionel Richie is, was talking about resurrecting the "We Are the World" song as a benefit for the world of suffering that is happening because of the virus. And so then I went back and I watched the "We Are the World" video, which was like a gem from my childhood. And guess what? For those of you, I'm assuming that none of you remember "We Are the World." That's okay, because we can play it anytime now. But there was this big song that starred like every single singer in the world back when in 1985. It was like a benefit song for helping people who didn't have enough food in Africa at the time. Anyways, like a huge number of star singers and vocalists participated in this video, so it's kind of a big production and a big deal back in the day. And it turns out they created a pop filter in just the exact fashion that I told you, the very cheap way of putting pantyhose on a clothes hanger. So it's in here somewhere. Willie's got his little turn at the mic. There, you can see it. Yeah, so that's how you can make it work. I just want to watch Bruce here because he cracks me up. All right, I'm going to stop the video now, and I've got one little point to make in a short video later.